Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Sam Koslowski.
A new bill in New South Wales Parliament has reignited a debate around abortion 6 years after the state decriminalised the procedure. Parties have allowed their members to choose how they vote, protesters have gathered outside Parliament, and one upper house MP has compared abortion to Nazi Germany. In today's show, we'll explain why the medical procedure was up for discussion once again and what is changing.
Lucy, I'd really appreciate if you started this off by kind of setting the scene for us, not just of the status of abortion in New South Wales, but across the entire country. Give us a sense of how the law looks right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Abortion is legally accessible in every jurisdiction around Australia. In New South Wales specifically, it was decriminalised in 2019. Anywhere in the world that abortion is safely accessible, there are two kind of main ways that you can get one. There's what we call medical abortion and surgical abortion. I'll just talk very briefly about surgical procedures because that's not the focus of today's discussion. Basically, that's when you're put under some form of sedation or anaesthetic. In New South Wales, doctors can perform them up to 22 weeks gestation. After that point, if there are sufficient grounds and if you have the approval of at least 2 doctors, then you can have that procedure. That is in very rare cases where the pregnancy is not going to continue or there's a significant risk to the life of the mother.
Okay, and so what's medical abortion?
Yeah, so that's involving pills. These can be performed up to 63 days gestation. There's 2 medications. They're given separately. They're called mifepristone and misoprostol. It's typically sold as MS two-step. It's actually been available in Australia to some extent since 1996, so my whole lifetime.
Yeah.
And since 2013, it's been listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, or the PBS, which means the government subsidises it. And so that means it costs a maximum of, currently, $31.60.
And you said at the top, though, that there's a new debate about abortion in the New South Wales Parliament. What is that debate centering on?
So earlier this year, Greens MP Amanda Cohn introduced a bill in the upper house. She was elected in 2023, so she's a relatively new MP. And Cohn is also a doctor who has performed abortions.
Right.
Just to be super clear, very briefly, New South Wales has 2 houses of parliament. There's the lower house where your local member sits and the upper house where the members represent the whole state. The government forms in the lower house. That's typically where bills get introduced, but not exclusively. You can introduce a bill in the upper house. It then goes down to the lower house, a reversal of what usually happens, but it goes down to the lower house. It might get amended and then it can, become law from there. So this began in the upper house and has only been debated in the lower house this week.
And so she brought this bill in the upper house. That's slightly unusual, but not unheard of. What was she seeking?
She wanted to allow registered nurses and endorsed midwives, these are professionals who undergo special training, to prescribe abortion medication. That would bring New South Wales in line with other jurisdictions, including Queensland and the ACT. That part is what has been debated in the lower house this week. The first draft of Cohn's bill, however, had a few other things it wanted to do. It would have required the government to ensure abortion services are accessible, quote, within a reasonable distance of residents' homes.
Wow.
It also sought to change how conscientious objections to abortion work. Now, what that means is, currently under the law, if a doctor has a moral objection to providing an abortion, they must tell their patient where they can access one.
So they're not compelled to perform the abortion themselves, but they have to provide a pathway for the patient to access one.
Yes, and Cohn wanted to strengthen that pathway. She wanted to make it so that doctors would be required to actually refer patients to someone who is willing to provide an abortion. So really actively taking that step rather than simply telling their patient, this is where you can go, like making that phone call themselves.
Right, interesting. Okay, so it's less about sending them a link for another clinic nearby. It's a formal referral, I guess, in a letter.
Yes. However, those bits did not pass the upper house, but the bit about nurses and midwives did pass, and that ended up passing the lower house on Wednesday as well. That was interesting because it's typically harder for a member of a party that's not in power to pass a bill, but this bill went to something called a conscience vote, which means parties could make up their own minds individually rather than making a decision as a whole collective, which is what they typically do, the major parties.
Do we have any sense of the positions of the various members of the party?
Yeah. So the Greens supported their colleague, as did Sydney Independent MP Alex Greenwich, and Premier Chris Minns also supported the bill. I should note that many of the current MPs across both houses of Parliament were in Parliament in 2019 when the original bill was passed, since we've only had one state election since then.
Yeah.
One such MP is Upper House National Sarah Mitchell. She said she had some concerns with the bill, but said overall she's pro-choice and her opinion has not changed since 2019, when she also voted in favour of decriminalising abortion. I also wanted to read a bit of what Labor Lower House MP Dr. Michael Holland said. He represents the regional electorate of Bega, where he worked as a doctor for decades. And that is sort of the exact regional areas that Cone was targeting with her original bill. And also, right. With the finalised bill too, in terms of making abortion more accessible, allowing more people to prescribe it could in some way reduce the strain on country GPs, make it easier for people to access it. Here's what Holland said. He said, quote, "I have the unique position of having held the curette, held the forceps, and held the scalpel." He's referring there to the instruments used in surgical abortions. He said, "I cannot say that I have not had conflict over ethical reproductive issues. No doctor enjoys performing abortions. They are confronting procedures for doctors and the healthcare professionals who assist them. But it is the women who choose or need an abortion who are the focus of our clinical care, and it is the responsibility of government to provide safe and accessible reproductive health care." So some fairly strong words from someone who has been in the situation that Cone is attempting to remedy.
What's really interesting about this is the two voices who you've focused on here, Cone and that member you just quoted, they're both former doctors.
Yeah.
That's quite a high concentration of medical professionals in a kind of political setting.
Yeah.
Now, I know we've got a couple of doctors in federal politics and across the states and territories, but that's interesting. And so you've mentioned there the Labor Party, the Greens and the Nationals.
Yeah.
Have we heard from the Liberal Party on this debate?
Yes. So one thing about a conscience vote is that you're going to get very different views from people who are within the same party.
Sure.
So back in the Upper House, we heard from Liberal MP Chris Rath. He was not in Parliament for the 2019 vote. He came in afterwards. And he said he opposed the bill in its entirety. He cited his religious beliefs. He said he could not support a bill that causes, quote, "physical and psychological harm to the mother and the intentional ending of a viable baby's life." He went on to compare abortion, which he described as, quote, "taking the life of another being," to the activities of the Nazi Party in Germany during World War II. He has since apologised for this comparison. However, within the same party, we had opposition leader Mark Speakman. He gave a really interesting speech in support of the bill, even though he is not personally in favour of abortion. He said he opposed the decriminalisation in 2019 because he's opposed to the procedure in general. However, he said he doesn't believe increasing the number of people who can prescribe the medication will increase the number of abortions overall, and said, quote, "Some women who would be choosing abortions anyway will now have access to earlier and less traumatic treatment."
Interesting kind of nuanced take on it.
Yes, but the real headline from his speech was that he quoted from a letter he received from a woman called Dr. Joanna Howe. She's an anti-abortion advocate and a professor at the University of Adelaide, and she said she would, quote, "lead a public campaign aimed at encouraging a grassroots opposition to his Liberal Party leadership if he voted in favour of the bill." In response to that, he said he would, quote, "not cave to brazen bullying like this, nor to the Americanisation of New South Wales politics, and would ultimately vote in favour of the bill."
And that's,
so pretty striking.
It's fascinating. And that's something I've been thinking about through this chat is the American flavour of this discussion. I mean, it's been a major talking point in the lead up to the second term of President Trump. Hasn't been as much of a dominant issue in this first 100 days of his presidency, but I dare say it will kind of come up again, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade a couple of years ago.
Yes.
But returning now to New South Wales, There was a comment there about a grassroots opposition. What has the reaction been outside Parliament?
So obviously just mentioned Dr. Joanna Howe. She organised a rally outside New South Wales Parliament last week, which was attended by a senior Catholic Church official, Anthony Fisher, and former Prime Minister Tony Abbott.
Right.
While it might be kind of surprising that a former Prime Minister would come to a state rally, like outside a state parliament for a state bill, he has been vocally critical of abortion for most of his political career.
Yeah.
In 2004, while he was health minister, he called the country's rate of abortion, quote, a tragedy, saying he didn't want to stigmatise Australians who had had abortions, but wanted to, quote, create a culture where people understand that actions have consequences, and called abortion an easy way out.
It is worth mentioning that Tony Abbott lives in Sydney, so he
Yes.
didn't, this is a geographically relevant place for him to be
That's true.
protesting, so that's worth mentioning.
That's true. At the time that he was health minister, anyone who wanted to take mifepristone, so that's one of the drugs that I mentioned earlier, had to have his written permission. In 2006, the federal government also held a conscience vote where it voted to actually take that power away from Tony Abbott and give it to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or the TGA, that giving it then the power to approve its use, which paved the way for it being listed on the PBS. That all happened outside the walls of New South Wales Parliament, however, where a bill to allow nurses and midwives to prescribe that same drug has in fact passed.
A really interesting topic, and it's always fascinating to hear about the different tracks that federal and state politics can take, even when it comes to the same issue and approaching it from so many different and nuanced angles. Lucy, thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning. That's all we've got for you for this episode, but we're going to be back in your ears for this afternoon's headline. Some exciting news. We have just launched a finance newsletter. I'll throw a link to that in today's show notes. Some more great work from the TDA team. We'll speak to you later.